Hello. Tila. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm good morning. I'm Tenzin Dalha from Tibet Policy Institute. I'm your host today. So I hope everyone has a sound rest and everyone is prepared for today's session. We are conducting second day, first session. And we have 4 prominent speakers for the first session. So we need to focus more with the time management. We have a framework of 20 minutes, so within 20 minutes, you need to finish your presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. So we have first speaker, Mr. Doddi Chandu, and he's going to speak on China's manipulation of Tibetan identity, a study of international journal affairs. So, Mr. Chandu, please, the floor is yours. Yeah.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chandu. I'm pursuing PhD in Chinese Studies at JNU. So this is my first time in, is it? Okay. Is it better now? Isn't it on? Okay, now? Yeah. Okay. Okay, once again, repeat. Good morning, everyone. My name is Chandu. I'm pursuing Chinese Studies as my PhD program in JNU. I did my BA and MA in Chinese. So most of the images I use in this PPT are from Chinese sources, and the maps are as per the Chinese perception. So initial disclaimer that please consider with your all kindness. No cartography violation here, deliberately. So here I use the first image of from the Why China to show how the identity of Tibet is, and then how the locals are constantly monitored. Just to open up with the very theme itself. And we see how religious places have turned into tourist spots. And then how people, after going there for fully sponsored visits, transform their perceptions as well. To give an anecdote in the beginning itself, one of my juniors, the person along with other person, 2 of them visited Tibet last year on a fully funded trip. So I asked them, how was your trip to Tibet? To my surprise, they corrected me. No, I did not go to Tibet. I went to Shitsang. So that's how I begin this. Okay. Okay. As we all know, this region, it's a water tower as the water tower of Asia. And I would like to, many rivers originate from this region. I would like to point out the rivers which flow towards South Asia, which are of major significance to us. So 3 river systems flow through this region, be it Indus, Ganga, or Brahmaputra, and we see the tributaries as well, the major tributaries flowing from this region. And from towards the Chinese side, you have Yellow and Yangtze River, and of course towards the Southeast Asia as well. And it's nicknamed as a third pole, but sometimes even the Chinese, to critique the very names given to these, like is it Asia Tower, third pole. So when we do Google Scholar or CNKI search, sometimes Chinese, the authors, they themselves make critique, should Tibet be called a third pole or an Asia Tower? Because they want to remove the tag so that whatever environmental conditions that align with it also disappear gradually. So, and then we see hydrologically, that region is so important, and that it influenced the monsoon season and also the many religious places as well. So that's in that outset. Next slide, please. Sir, next. So, and then in the region, China is known for hydropower development to an extensive level. So the two images on the right side, it says massive hydropower projects. How do they light up China? So these two are images, basically poster images from a Chinese channel. It's like Chinese equivalent of Nat Geo or Discovery type, and it's fully funded by the Chinese party state apparatus, and they're quite active on YouTube as well. So if you type Institute for Planets, its English name, you'll find their videos in it. So they also make videos on Medoc region, and then for them, to give an example, for them Brahmaputra ends not at Geling in Arunachal, rather it's at Pasighat. So it's just at above the Assam plains. So, no, left, previous one. So here we see within Tibet itself, from 2000 onwards, we see there are so many dams being planned or under construction, and of which 60% are in the planning or in the construction. So there is a possibility, but to convince Chinese is a major thing, and so most likely they will, in most of the acts, they will be unilateral in their acts. And then for them, right on my birthday, on 19 July, Li Qiang has said that they will initiate the Yalung Sampo project. And that is actually my PhD project. And this my PhD topic is China's transboundary water approaches, implications for Yalung Sampo and Brahmaputra. And I took a time frame of 2002 till 2023. And when I tried to analyze the articles, I tried to take a similar time frame of 2000 till 2024. And I took a sample size of 30 articles from CNKI, which is a Chinese equivalent of Google Scholar type. So you may call I have a sample bias, but for the most of the articles I measured them. The general trend I observed, you will see in the remaining slides. Next one, sir. So the framework under which I try to observe these and I try to analyze is the environmental geopolitics. So here we see in the articles I try to understand what is the rhetoric they are trying to bring in. So they show Tibet as ecologically they are restoring the region, and then they're providing clean energy with a mix of tidal, solar, wind power, but at the same time what comes at the cost. And then and most of the times the Chinese refer to managing the regions in a scientific management. So scientific management is also decoyed or in a way that suits the Chinese one, but that comes at a cost of the locals and also the region. And then coming to the crux, how these narratives are formed in the academic journals, which are rather later quoted by media and also later comes into mainstream. So I'm trying to understand this. So next slide. So now coming to the discourse one in academics. So we see the directive is to use, like yesterday in the keynote address by my supervisor, Professor Shrikant, you'll see how they have a lot of Tibetologists in the Beijing-based China Tibetology Research Center. So how you see they are the core one, and predominantly it's filled with Han Chinese people, but there are some handful of Tibetans as well. And then many times they invite foreign people also who align their views with Chinese. So in 2013, Xi Jinping said that tell China's stories well. So when you tell China's stories well, it means you have to tell the party state narrative in a way that suits them, but that comes at a disadvantage for others, including their own people as well. Here it is Tibet. So And then when I see the funding pattern of these articles, so many of them, even now, be it any majority of the journal articles published in Elsevier, Springer, all these major journal articles, you'll find if they are by Chinese authors, as you could see by the names, most of them they'll mention in the funding statement at the last part, they are funded by so-and-so organization. If they are Chinese, most likely they are funded by, say, if the articles are trying to observe, they are a mix of social science and science, like they could be botanical or zoological or something on ethnography. So it's a mix of 30 articles I try to source from CNKI. So majority of them, they have funding from NSFC, National Science Foundation for China, and then CAS, China Academy of Sciences. And the building next to in the image is the headquarters of China Academy of Sciences in Beijing. And then if they are related to Chinese language related, you'll find funded by the Confucius Institute. And in Chinese, they call it Han Pan. And then since these Tibetologists work on topics related to Tibet exclusively, but they ensure that they fall well below the Lakshman Rekha, the Chinese red line. So within that red line, any of these sensitive topics or even self-immolation, none of these are the environmental issues, they don't matter in them. For example, on September 19, just a month back, a Chinese famous artist named Cai Qiang. So he's a famous artist known for pyrotechnics and drone display of fireworks and all. So what he did is that he wanted to show a dragon in pyrotechnics in Shigatse, just opposite of Bhutan, and it's a bordering for Tawang as well. So there he used some 3,000 plus pyrotechnics of display, which shows as a dragon moving around through pyrotechnics. But that received, and they got prior approvals from the Shigatse City Environmental Bureau, Tibet and all. And then, but unfortunately, and they tied up with a outdoor brand called Architrex. It's a Canada-based, but it's a Chinese-owned brand. So when that happened, it received a major backlash from the Han Chinese itself. So I tried to track them on Weibo. All those comments were like fried papad type. So you're coming and they are disappearing. So I tried to screenshot, but I could not do that. So, but it's very interesting how Han Chinese themselves are criticizing the Chinese actions in Tibet. And then they started even questioning Cai Qiang, whether his son and daughter are Chinese or American passports. And then they try to dig information. In Chinese, they call it doxing. So doxing refers to digging personal information of people to humiliate them. So they did find out that Cai Qiang's son and daughter are Americans, and they are not Chinese enough. So since they are not Chinese enough, that's why the Cai Qiang himself has damaged Tibet's pristine ecology. So within Tibet, you see, within Han Chinese also there are considerations for Tibet, but they are from civil society and their opinions are not respected. And then you see their comments in Weibo, they disappear very fast. So that's why Chinese studies is like finding a black cat in a dark room. Next one. So in research methodology, to understand these, as I said, I used 30 articles from, and the time frame I took is 2000 to 2024. And then I tried to find the words in the social sciences, sovereignty, the narratives they are using about infrastructure, and then what is the expertise of those articles. Like you click on the journals, you click what is their affiliation and their recent publications, and then you go to the respective universities, you find more information about the authors. And then here I applied the discourse analysis to find out how they are positioning the subject, and then trying to present that thing. Next. So I observed 4 broad themes. So the first one is Tibet is casted as a China's environmental asset. So to make it easy, so on the right side you see there's a image of the left. In the image, the left side is China, Beijing's bird nest. It's the largest Olympic-sized stadium. So only Tibet can, if that entire bird's nest stadium is filled with water, it's only Tibet, which is the bigger blue ball, can fill it with so many times that rest of the provinces neighboring to Tibet, say the right side is Sichuan and the lower right side, and the left side close to the bird's nest is Yunnan, Chongqing and Guizhou. They are all small balls. In a sense, like how much water they contain across the province. So it's only Tibet which carries the maximum amount of water. And they try to show it off because hydropower firms, they have it's all money involved in it. So when they want to invest, the party media, they also have to work in tandem with them. So here we see how they are pushed. And this image is also from the Institute of Planets. And here we see water and climate functions recast as national resources as per the state, and then integrated national management. So whenever they build hydropower farms or high voltage electric pylons, so they ensure that the resources they take in Tibet are not meant for Tibet rather than for other regions in the eastern part of China. Next slide, sir. And then in the second theme, I see how traditional practices are depicted as threats, are like in a way that they are not non-modern, or like they are not contemporary enough. So on the right side, I took two slides again from the Institute of Planets. It says in Chinese, even the mountains and seas cannot stop your courage. But the images they portray, as you could see, on one side, on the right one, it's a Han Chinese climbing the Kailash, close trekking in that area. And the left side, you see Tibetans in a very happy state, but at the same time showing their style of life. So they portray Tibet as a very exotic place, and then you'll find many disgruntled people, like those who feel uneasy with the life, you'll find, be it in India or other places, they go to the mountains and they spend time. So in the same way, there is a term called Tsang, which is from Shitsang, and then Piao means drifting. So there is a group of people called Tsang Piao. So Tsang Piao people, they are basically drifters. They are not migrants. So you'll find a lot of such Tsang Piao people drifting in Tibet for a long period. So they show that Han Chinese thing in right side, and also how the Tibetans are very happy in that ethnic unity. And then you see when they portray these articles, and for example, gas stove, uses of gas stove, firewood and all. So they, and also the traditional way of cooking. So here they show like pastoralism as well. Pastoralism is labeled as backward and blamed for grassland degradation despite contrary evidence. And then, for example, when Tsai Ko-chiang has did the pyrotechnics work, Shigatse city government has not made any comment. They just said that they will look into it. And the government, local government, they did not make any comment on Tsai Ko-chiang. But had it been done by a non-Han, a Tibetan or any other ethnic, then that person would have been disappeared. And then those narratives also legitimizes the relocation. So because they build these Xiaokang villages or other in a close grouping. So when we see, for example, in the same Institute of Planets, you open Medog, one of the videos, you'll find them, they are not living in the traditional accommodation, rather in high-rise buildings. So and then they push the narratives in a way that they should live a modern, comfortable life, in a way that the relocation is legitimized and they are provided incentives for it. But are they really happy leaving their own place? So that's a question again. And then the indigenous knowledge is also in a way. Next slide, I'll move. I have 2 minutes left. And again, in the third theme, we see hydropower is marketed as a green solution. So when yesterday we discussed AI and all, so why do they need a lot of hydropower from this region? So again, as we see, in Guizhou, Yunnan, Sichuan and all, there are a lot of data centers, AI data centers on which DeepSeek all these work. So for these data centers to work, even in Tibet to some extent, so for these data centers to work, As we know, it needs lot amount of fresh water and then huge amount of electricity. And Tibet provides both of these. And then if you go to Shanghai, you feel like you cannot distinguish between day and night. It's so bright neon grid. So to brighten those places, someone has to be in the dark. So in the next slide, you will see how Tibet is in the day and night. Next slide. And they show these regions as win-win cooperation as well. So when they work with lower riparian neighbors, how they portray these areas. So we see the large-scale hydropower projects are typically in and around Sichuan, Yunnan, and that region. And now at the Great Bend, we will have more as well in the coming years. Next. And the institutional landscape, as I mentioned, the authors' affiliation, they are predominantly with the state state institutions. So that carries that narrative accordingly. Next slide, please. And in the discourse, so how they portray this region, pre-liberation and post-liberation, they call it peaceful liberation. So pre and post, they portray these in the narratives. And then in the middle image, you see Tibet in the day and night. So in the day, it's in the nighttime, you see it's only bright in the Lhasa area, in the GIF image. And then but the rest is like that. So Tibet's hydropower and a lot of money generate from mining. Where does it go? So, and then you see, and they also portray the rivers originating from Tibet as China's transponded rivers, not Tibet, obviously. So, and you see all the major rivers flowing from that region, okay, next slide. So again, infrastructure projects as well. My time is up, I'm reminded. So I'll end here just move the next slide. Yeah. And here the seismic one, the Indian and Europe, the tectonic plates, and the fault zones in Medog region. Next one. And the grasslands and wetlands in that region and how they marginalize one. And then you see the cute cats and they are also from Medog region. Yesterday one girl said that they like cat. It's also from the same region. So once dams are built and that region is, people are relocated, we won't see this anymore. And then at the Pemako region itself, at each elevation you find different wildlife. So when that is disturbed, that won't be there anymore. And next slide. Yeah, thank you. The last one is in Chinese, it means Hao Chuan in you. It means throwing a brick to attract jade. So I'm throwing my comments as bricks. I hope you will throw back jade to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Doddi. Doddi's article publications have more focus with and reflection of how China's geographic interests in the Tibetan areas, and this study also reflects the research contributes to understanding of how environment issues intersect with geopolitics and knowledge protection as well as identity constructions. So thank you very much for very informative presentation. So next, for the second speaker, we have Dr. Pathik Roy. So his title is Post-Memory and Rehearsing the State, Tibetan Refugeehood and the Strategy of Identity Preservation. So may I have Dr. Pathik Roy.
Good morning to one and all. And yeah, with the permission of the chair, I'd like to start my paper. And my paper is titled Post-Memory and Rehearsing the State, Tibetan Refugeehood and the Strategy of Identity Preservation. The historical context of the Tibetan refugees goes back to the suppression of the Lhasa uprising. We have gone through that right from the beginning of this seminar, so I will skip that portion. But by and large, it is generally accepted that almost everybody agrees unequivocally with all the scholars that Tibetans have, on one hand, emerged as a model of good integration with the host population, while on the other, they have retained a way of life that may be considered ancestral. right, along symbolic, material, and mnemonic registers. So these three registers are not mutually exclusive. They kind of bleed into each other, activating a discourse that is at the heart of the Tibetan identity in exile. Now, the question of identity is a very vexed one. Early anthropological studies on Tibetan refugeehood emphasize the notion of adaptation, acculturation, and changes as the key processes through which a history of the Tibetans in exile may be charted. And I'm referring to Sudip Basu over here. And in his book, The Diasporic Lands, he talks about this line of inquiry. And, but at the end, he also says that it tends to portray Tibetan self-settled refugees as an emasculated version of an early pre-exilic Tibetan society, with the refugee society formation considered somewhat inauthentic and somewhat less Tibetan. Now, more modern critical engagements locate the hybridization of identities in general and Tibetan identities in particular with respect to the process of globalization. So undoubtedly, the Tibetan diaspora has been subjected to global cultural flows, and I'm referring to Appadurai over here, leading to possible erosions, strengthening, and emergence of new identities or new ethnicities. Right? And this is this whole idea of new ethnicities. I'm referring to Stuart Hall. Now, in this context, Mallika Mishra points out that in the atmosphere created by overarching effects of globalization, the invention, and I'm quoting Mishra, the invention of tradition and of ethnicity, kinship, and other identity markers, whether important, can become slippery as the search for certainties is regularly frustrated by the fluidities of transnational communication. So in both cases, right, whether we talk about acculturation and assimilation and that kind of a narrative, whether we talk about globalization, hybridization, there is an anticipated dilution of identity, right, in a very unwholesome way. Now, the point is, in this context, the present paper seeks to engage with the realities and necessities of Tibetan refugee identity through two allied conceptual registers or lenses. So one is the idea of post-memory, theorized by Mariana Hirsch, and it may be called the mnemonic register of reimagination, reformulation, and reinvigoration, and I would like to stress this last word, reinvigoration of the Tibetan identity threatened by anticipated dilution under the stress of acculturation and globalization. And the second one is the rehearsal of statehood, carried out with all its seriousness, and may I also say with all its intimacy, by the Central Tibetan administration, a mimicry, right, that is futuristic in its anticipation of sovereignty. So though apparently disparate, like this idea of post-memory on one hand, and the idea of rehearsal of the state on the other hand, a very kind of disparate, divergent kind of strands, but I would say that there is a kind of a connection between the two, because post-memory supplies the emotional and cultural content, while the rehearsal of the state provides the institutional framework, within which these memories are politically framed, enacted, and stabilized. So, now I'd get into this idea of post-memory by Hirsch, who defines it as the, and I'm quoting Hirsch over here, the relationship that the generation after bears to the personal, collective, and cultural trauma of those who came before, to experiences they remember, within quotes, only by means of stories, images, and behaviors among which they grew up. Now, this implies the constant company of overwhelming inherited memories, so much so that they become personal memories by their own rights. And this is extremely pertinent to a majority of the Tibetan refugees today. See, almost 66 years have elapsed since the Dalai Lama crossed over, right? And if you remember, yesterday we had this paper called Cultural Memory of Mughlod's Elderly Refugees, right? And I think that paper was by Professor Sriraj, and he said that if out of 17,000 refugees in that place, we have just about 200 people who have the direct memory of the crossing. Okay, so basically what is happening is that today we do not have the first generation anymore. Okay, so yeah, the point is, so today we have the succeeding generations who, though not a direct witness or a victim of 59, are indirectly impacted by the traumatic fragments of the past that they carry with them, the post-memory in the sense that Hirsch uses the term. So in her seminal book, The Generation of Post-Memory, she dwells upon the relationship to a parental past, right? So that the descendants of the victims, survivors, as well as perpetrators, connect so deeply with the previous generation's remembrances of the past that they identify that connection as a form of memory, and that, in certain extreme circumstances, memory can be transferred to those who are not actually there to live an event. So in a way, you see the guardianship of the stories of Tibet, right? The Chinese aggression, the flight of the Dalai Lama, the subsequent hardships, and all of that, and finding this new space in a new environment, in a new country, there is this transferred knowledge of events being transmuted into history and into myth. And those are the words of Hoffman. Now, it is indeed productive to explore the ways the construction and perpetuation and recycling of memory of the previous generation can be transferred into a potent political act of resistance, leading to the preservation of a distinct sociocultural and geopolitical identity of the Tibetan refugee formation. So Tibetans in exile exemplify this condition. For them, Tibet is an imagined space transmuted into a remembered space, through the narrative passed on from one generation to the next, through the enactment of rituals and all the practices that are preserved as a cornerstone of identity. Now, the construction and this perpetuation of traumatic memory occurs along multiple registers, broadly aligned to the idea of post-memory. Say one would be family narratives passed on like a generational heirloom, right? And it plays a very fundamental role. The stories of escape across the Himalayas, the destruction of monasteries back in Tibet, the Dalai Lama's leadership, all of these circulate in the households, right? And therefore, trauma becomes gets metamorphosized into a kind of a cultural capital, as it were, The second thing, of course, and I'd refer to Claire Harris over here, and in her book, In the Image of Tibet, I'd like to, bring in visual culture over here. She shows and she notes how exile culture reproduces imagined images of Tibet, mountains, monasteries, saints, whatever, but these are the visual memory of a place that they've never been to. For instance, say the Thangka paintings, right, that form a part of Tibetan cultural consciousness. And they remain empowering within Tibetan Buddhist practice as markers of important life events. They continue to have a role when commissioned for commemoration of the dead, to aid good rebirth, to tell stories of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas, to gain merit, and all of that. So they are, they are a part of the Tibetan, the material culture of the Tibetans, right? So material and visual arts that partake of a pre-exilic life are signifiers that mark spaces as distinctly Tibetan, all right? And this is where I would like to bring in, the idea of place-making, something that Sudip Basu talks about in his book, The Diasporic Lands, in the idea of place-making, because it would involve strategies and tactics that are both material and symbolic. Now, so then you have the performing arts. I'll have to skip all that section, but religious, that is another register through which post-memory gets recycled. Religious practices, they are central. The monasteries here in exile replicate those destroyed or controlled in Tibet, okay? So wherever refugee camps are there, we have the prayer flag, the tachok, okay, we have the choten, we have the gumbas, and all of these, the rituals connected with birth, death, marriages, these are all an integral part of the religious life of Tibet, and it continues in an unbroken kind of a tradition taken over from Tibet. Again, as far as commemoration of public and political act, the ritual performance of remembering 1959 uprising through mass protests every year on March 10th is an acting out of a historically inscribed collective memory. To that extent, post-memory scripts a subversive and historically inflected narrative of resistance. Now, see, intergenerational memory also requires a language, because language is not just about communication, it is basically, it evolves from a sociocultural matrix, and every time we use a language, we are kind of delving into the resources of that particular sociocultural matrix, right? So we have, it would be a great loss of cultural memory if, due to linguistic marginalization, globalization, Sanskritization, that is a major concern. So we have the Central School for Tibetan, which facilitates the use of mother tongue, Tibetan, as a medium of instruction in all Tibetan schools till class 5, I think. And thereafter, the language gets taught as a second language. The classroom is a prime socializing space for the refugee children, and the educational structure which is in place prevents the obliteration of cultural memory of the Tibetan experience. With regard to this, it is pertinent to refer to a book of paintings, and actually I don't have a PPT as it were, but I just have a few slides that I'd like to show you. And this is a compilation by Shara Lucas and Kitty Leakins from the children of the Tibetan Homes Foundation in Mussoorie. Okay, this is from that book, and the school was established in '62 to cater to the needs of the disadvantaged Tibetan refugee children of South Asia. The book is titled Art of Exile, Paintings by Tibetan Children, and you have this 4 sections to it. All right, I'd just like to show one picture from each section. The first one is called Leaving Tibet, the second is Life in India, the third is Remembering Home, and the fourth is Political Paintings. So yeah, the first one, see, this is His Holiness leaving Tibet on a yak. And if you see, that is drawn, painted by Nawang Yuden. And you have the rainbow and you have the sun, and that side, I think, is India, you see. And so you see how, visual culture helps to perpetuate that kind of a memory. And I have one more over there. This is a slightly traumatic one. That's why I showed this. This is Hiding by Tenzin Norbu, and you have these trees being cut, and I think that is the brother of the person, of the child who drew this, and he's hiding from the, and there's a lot of fear in this particular picture. And this is Life in India. It's a very nice image, me and my brother going to school, but this is Remembering Home. This is the third section, the making hapses, especially during losses, all right? And okay, yes, this is the political painting where Tibet bleeds. Okay, that is the name, that is by Karma Sope. And he says this entire black thing, he actually explains that. He says, I draw it on a black canvas because it kind of symbolizes the way in which the Chinese atrocities occur, in complete darkness. Nobody knows anything about it. So yes, so now, the way post-memory functions brings into its ambit not merely identity preservation, but also political resistance. And so you have cultural preservation is actually an act of self-assertion, all right? So the Tibetan Institute of Performing Arts, that was founded in '59, stages traditional opera and music suppressed in Tibet, asserting cultural sovereignty through performance. This is kind of keeping Tibet alive on stage. So consequently, inherited memory does not paralyze communities. This is one thing that I'd like to put across. It doesn't paralyze communities, but has the capacity to generate action. So post-memory is that nebulous, unceasing script that provides the rationale for political action. And this resistance can take, of course, multiple forms, as I talked about the commemoration of March 10th, okay, and which is carried out by the second and the third generation Tibetans. And yes, and then you have other youth organizations. Now, I would like to take up the second part, the second strand of my paper, what Fiona McConnell famously calls rehearsing the state. Now, you see, no government or state legally recognizes the central government, the Tibetan government in exile. In essence, so this institution has, quote unquote, no legal jurisdiction either in Tibet or over people around here in that sense. And yet, we have a parliament in exile. I think this is the 16th parliament in exile that is there right now. And we have this formed from elective representatives from the 3 provinces, I think the 10 each, and then we have 2 from each of the 5 Buddhist sects, okay, that we have people, representatives from all over the globe. So it's a very kind of a comprehensive body, and it is duly elected. We have the Sikyong, we had the good fortune of meeting him yesterday, and we have the Kaluns, and I think in the 16th parliament it's only 3 Kaluns, but then you can have up to 7 if I'm not mistaken. And the Charter of the Tibetans in Exile is the supreme law which governs the CTA, and post 2011, there was an amendment to the charter where His Holiness devolved the full political authority to the popularly elected leadership. Now, the charter is a detailed, quasi-constitutional document that runs into 45 pages, 11 chapters. It has a preamble, it has a directive principles of state policy, the fundamental rights, the fundamental duties, the clear demarcation of, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. And in some ways, it kind of reminds us of the Indian Constitution. So in real terms, again, the CTA, through a structured hierarchy of functionaries, organizes parliamentary elections, they manage the educational institutions, they initiate and execute health campaigns, design welfare programs in the settlements, oversee international advocacy programs, and we had a glimpse of how intense that is yesterday, all right, and acts as an overarching structure of liaison and advocacy in the global level. Now, however, I am more interested in the symbolic dimension of the government in exile, which may be read as a rehearsal of the state that is presently an imagined one and perhaps a remembered one. So it is imagined through memory. You see, that is the point that I'm trying to put across. So significantly, a rehearsal always carries with it the possibility of the real in the future, and more importantly, it signifies participation, practice, expertise, engagement, leading to a solidarity based on a sense of identity. So this rehearsing of the state in a condition without territory, without sovereignty, is an overarching psychological meta-narrative. It is a psychological thing, right, that stabilizes and embodies the fragments of memory circulating in the collective consciousness of the exiled population. Though undoubtedly it has a concrete and functional institutional framework, the government in exile draws its power and functions through images, through metaphors, and through representational practices. So exile polity has strategically fused the inherited cultural memory with embodied political practice to sustain a coherent national identity. So Tibet persists, not in a despairing nostalgia, but as an active project of cultural and political continuity, keeping alive the possibility of territorial sovereignty, however deferred it may be. So therefore, and I've already got the ultimatum of 1 minute now, I think. So in conclusion, one may engage with the question posed by Snellgrove and Richardson, all right, in the cultural history of Tibet. I think that is the book, and they say, what now becomes of Tibetan civilization? Now, while it is true that Tibet does not exist as a nation in the nomenclature of contemporary world politics, I'm quoting Harris over there, it is very much a part of the global imaginary, and ironically, it is not the population of the TAR, okay, and that's a huge population over there, but it is not that population. But it is the smaller community of exiles who formulate, perpetuate, and reinvigorate the idea of Tibet in the global imaginary. It is not the people inside, it is the people outside who are carrying on Tibet. Thence, with the passing of generations and the dilution of the first generation lived experiences, the use of memory and state rehearsal as political tools of resistance gain paramount importance in the preservation of a distinct sociocultural, ethnic, and political identity. Hirsch's concept of post-memory, when brought in dialogue with the idea of the rehearsed state, reveals a strategic palimpsest of identity preservation where intergenerational memory transfer transmutes into a lived political practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much for a very insightful and comprehensive presentation. So, yeah. Full screen mode, okay.
Yeah. You want to sit here?
No, I'll do it from there. Oh, okay. Full screen mode. So, Pathik's presentation, deliberate about how inherited traumas from the 1959 exodus through stories and behaviors that become overwhelming personal, and his research shows that the how studies to a political resistance. Thank you so much, sir. So next speaker we have Dr. Barun Roy. Dr. Barun Roy speaks on an engagement in Tibetan media history through critical discourse analysis of media in news from various regions of the world, published in Kalimpong, India from 1925 to 1963. So we have Dr. Barun Roy.
Thank you very much. So journalists don't just report news, they write history. Historians pick up from where the journalists left. Journalism is the first rough draft of history. Problematic, isn't it, that declaration? In a postmodern and a post-truth world, and in a world that is now driven by artificial intelligence, this statement is extraordinarily problematic, but yet it stands. Good morning, Tasidile. Namaste, my name is Barun Roy. Next slide, please. Today, I would first like to thank Tibet Policy Institute, because this is not just a research, this is a project. Last year, we had talked about something that we wanted to do, and that is start a documentation and an archival center at the Department of Mass Communication in North Bengal University, where we'll be archiving and we'll be documenting newspapers, regional newspapers from our region. So that's why this is a project in that sense, and I'm grateful to Tibet Policy Institute, and I'm also grateful to my students, particularly those who are part of the Dead Poets Society. We have a small society which is called Dead Poets Society, and a big shout out to my students and my scholars. Many of them I'm trying to prepare for Tibetan studies, so they will be doing their PhDs. They have helped a lot in this. And I'm just presenting here, but their spirit is also with me. So my topic today is an engagement in Tibetan media history through socio-historical contextual analysis of Tibetan newspaper, that is Tibet Mirror. It is called Melong, and it was started in Kalimpong. Next slide, please. Now, my interaction with Tibet Policy Institute has so far been very fruitful, and it has yielded two papers. One was published in Tibet Policy Institute journal last year, and another was in Asian ethnicity. My work basically now deals with the discourses and basically with diasporic media. So within diasporic media, I have talked in last year, I've done research which basically deals with discourses within diasporic media. So this was the paper which was first published. Thank you very much. Could you please, yes, thank you so much. So my focus now is basically diasporic media in India, within which I'm now focusing on Tibetan diasporic media. And as I have already said, that I have worked on Tibetan diasporic media discourses. This particular topic today that I'll be discussing with is based on Tibetan media history. Next slide, please. Now, media history is very interesting subject within the field of mass communication, media studies. But if we look at media history research within India, it has been very less. Now, I have taken into consideration when I was taking a literature review, I was doing a literature review, I have taken into consideration media history, which is one of the leading journals in the world, which is published by Ruthless. And if you see in media history, and if you practically try to look at what kind of researches has been done when it comes to media history in India, you'll find that there has been almost less than 2.3% of submissions are from India. Now, all those work which was done from India, 60% of those, 63% of those are actually from foreign scholars, which means that Indian scholars are not actually indulging in, media history. Very few of them. So, and if you look at what kind of the work are being done, if you look at media history, there will be two strands of literature that you will see. And those two strands are, one, on the colonial media, if you look at it in the pre-independence era, And then, of course, with the famously vernacular media during the independence struggle. And I have problem with a lot of things about vernacular media itself. Next slide, please. Now, that's why if you look at the lacuna when it comes to media history research in India, you will find methodological limitations. First of all, sources becomes the biggest problem, when archives, we are searching for archives becomes the biggest problem. I will also elaborate on that later. And what happens is the fragmentation and lack of multidisciplinary approaches. The biggest problem when it comes to media history, it is written by historians without taking into account mass communication or media scholars. So it is not multidisciplinary in a sense. Okay? The other problem that I have found is that there is a neglect of regional narratives. When vernacular, we are talking about vernacular, we are talking about Hindi, Tamil, Bengali, but we are not talking about marginalized, we are not talking about indigenous languages. We are not talking about Naga languages, Mizo, or Nepali, or Tibetan for that matter. So in that sense, what happens is the voices of the regional actors becomes lost. Okay, so next slide, please. So the rationale, and this is a project that we are trying to engage upon, and we are trying to build an archive, a solid archive based on which we can generate and we can engage in in-depth research, in-depth analysis of all the magazines, journals, periodicals which can be studied. The other thing is we are trying to engage in multidisciplinary approach. So this time what would happen is historians, mass communication, media studies scholars, everyone, and we have, for example, been negotiating, we have been working together, that is Center for Himalayan Studies in North Bengal University. So based on a disciplinary approach, we are trying to work. The other is to bring about the focus back on the marginalized and the regional narratives. Okay, so that's why I have taken here the Tibetan diasporic new media as a case study of the neglected subaltern media history. Next slide, please. Now, yes, for that study, I have taken into account the mirror of the news from various regions of the world. It was also referred to simply as the Melong. Now, this is a wonderful newspaper that was published from Kalimpong from 1925 to 1963. It started as a monthly newspaper and went on to become a weekly newspaper. It is fantastically in the sense that it was in Tibetan, but it was also contained, the contents were in Nepali, in Hindi, in Urdu, and in English. So you will have to wonder, about the versatility of the editor. And the editor was, of course, Mr. Gegan Dorjil Thachin, and I'll be talking about him a little bit later. And it was based on subscription mode. It was a very small production, but the beauty of it was it had extraordinary circulation. His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, the British House, everyone were actually the subscribers to this newspaper. That also shows how powerful this newspaper was. And being based in Kalimpong, it was transported and taken by the caravan, yak traders. So we have been able to have, and thanks to Columbia University, Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and Yale University, we have tried, and of course, the great-grandson of Mr. Thachin, Daniel Thachin, who is still there in Kalimpong, we have been able to access 1,853 pages, which amounts to 224 issues, and of course, 707 pages, which again amounts to 71 issues. So we have an excess of 2,500 pages of newspapers in our disposal. Next slide, please. So, we cannot move ahead without talking about Gergen Dorje Thachin. What is the most beautiful thing was that he was Tibetan, but he was Indian. He was born in Himachal Pradesh, who went and migrated to Kalimpong and started his newspaper there. He was a Christian by faith and not a Buddhist. So he was a Christian pastor, and he actually started the newspaper as a part of a Christian proselytizing agenda. but he changes on the way. You know, from 1925 to 1963, from the age of 35 to 73 years of age, he worked as a journalist. And it is said that he started this newspaper with a 20 rupees gift from His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama, and of course later on it was funded by the Scottish Guild Mission. Now you have to understand that because he was a Christian pastor and this was funded by the Scottish Guild, what it meant that it was supposed to be for the propagation of Christianity. But the problem is there is where Tharchin changes. And I'll be arguing in the sense that, you know, how he becomes more a journalist than a Christian pastor trying to, proselytize the populace there. And he would use a lithographic printing media. Next slide, please. Now, this is very interesting. If you look at Melong, if you look at Melong, and the beautiful thing of Melong is the fact that it has evolved from 1925 to 1963. It has seen the reign of 13th Dalai Lama, the 14th Dalai Lama, and it starts from the Ming Dynasty and covers the Second World War and the flight of His Holiness, the 14th Dalai Lama, the independence of India, and it is everything chronicled within those periods. If you see and read and go through Melong for the 63 years, you will find not just the history of Tibet unpacked or unwrapped or unrevealed, but you will also see the history of the entire region. You know, so in that sense, it is so extraordinarily beautiful. And what Tharchin does is that he has used his pen and he has used his sketches. He was a terrible sketcher, he was a terrible, but the drawings he makes are extraordinarily powerful, If you if you saw the first slide where he has made a kind of, airplanes dropping bombs over the monasteries, it looks like the images of, he must have heard that the monasteries was being bombed in Tibet, and then he created those drawings himself, It might sound, it might look kiddish, but today it becomes a cultural and historical artifact. So in that sense, it is so very beautiful. All those drawings, look at the maps that he has created by hand. And in one place, he actually discusses and, fights over the name of how Tenzin Norge's name was misspelled, by other, newspapers. So actually, he's very angry, and he writes in this editorial that his name should be spelled in this way. So in that sense, next slide, please. This is a beautiful thing. I was able to access, his book. Here, he notes all the subscriptions, where the newspaper was sent. So he would write down the names of newspapers sent and the postage, how much it cost. If we just go through this entire register, you will see the names of His Holiness, the 13th Dalai Lama, 14th Dalai Lama, Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek actually has played a very important role in Tibetan history also. Of course, complicated, all those things are different, but his name is still there. And there are a lot of other people. So this also becomes very fantastic and interesting. Can I have a next slide, please? Now, what is my research objectives? My research objectives are to ascertain how Tibet as a nation was imagined. Okay, the second objective is to examine how Tibet as a literary language was established. Tibetan, as a literary language was established. And to investigate the evolution of Tibetan journalism in India. Now, you have to remember, Tharchin was not a trained journalist. His English was not that good. And if you look at, Melong, you'll find a lot of spelling mistakes. But the fact that he wrote long editorials in English means that he was, determined, confident. And that shows, his determination and his power. So, if you look, Tibetan as a language was basically a theological language, and this was for the first time, I believe, I argue, is being used in a secularistic, project. So there is a secularization of Tibetan language as such. In a sense, Tibetan language was trying to be used in a modern, worlds. Okay. And the other thing is that, yes, Tibetan journalism was being evolved. How the Tibetan journalism actually evolved can be traced through this. Yeah, next slide, please. Yes, I'll be careful. Okay, so how did the Tibetan mirror shape? So these are the specific research questions. How did the Tibetan mirror shape early Tibetan public debate? How did Thachin's editorial instance influence debates on nationalism? In what ways did the newspaper blend religious and secular topics to reach readers? How did Thachin's background shape the paper's political framing? Next slide, please. So the methodology that I have used is that socio-historical contextual analysis. I've tried to look at the historical context on which, because remember, this was where Thachin was leaving what we are looking at today as a part of a post-memory kind of thing, isn't it? He was living through those things, so we have to understand he was reporting. So those were the lived experience, so we'll have to see the historical context of that. Intellectual and the cultural context, political structures that existed then, and then, of course, the social norms. Next slide, please. Now, theoretical framework I've tried to use is Benedict Anderson's Imagined Communities, because Tibet, though it was a nation, it had to be imagined. So what Tibetans are, what Tibetans will be, could be arguably, as an imagined communities. And then, of course, institutional secularization theory, because here they had to go, when he was acting as a journalist, he had to go beyond the idea of just theocracy. And then, of course, transcultural approach in communication protocols, because he was trying to, recreate, or not recreate, he was trying to sort of, invent, sort of establish journalism, Tibetan journalism from the very, it was the start of the evolution of Tibetan element. And then, of course, mediatization, how mediatization was taking place. Next slide, please. If you look at the present Dalai Lama and the 13th Dalai Lama, the present Dalai Lama, His Holiness, is actually, a media creation in that sense also, arguably. Now, the limitations are that this research is still ongoing. I want to do a comparative study with another contemporary newspaper that was called the Mongolian Tibetan, a weekly newspaper, which was published by Kuomintang in Nanjing. I do not know whether they have archive or not. I want to go to Tibet, and then I want to study this. I've been using the help of translators who are actually my own PhD scholars. So we'll have to, go and find even better translators and higher authorities in Tibetan language. So these are my limitations. So next slide, please. Now, let's go to the findings. Yeah. So how did the Tibet mirror shape early Tibetan public debate? Now, promoting new knowledge and worldviews. So if you look at it right from 1925, Thachin actually was educating people. He believed that Tibetans were actually, fallen into, I use the word, his own words, fallen into the trap of medieval, theocracy. So he was born in India, educated in India, and he was highly westernized. He believed that Western education must be inculcated. So he was using his newspaper to inculcate new ideas, new knowledge, scientific knowledges. If you look at it, the other thing is expanding the public sphere. Public sphere had to go out from the monasteries and go out into the clubs, into the printing houses. So actually Kalimpong, Tibet Mirror Press in Kalimpong became kind of a place where people gathered and they talked and they discussed, So those Tibetans who were studying outside started coming there, and in Kalimpong, it started becoming a place, a hub where people just sat down and talked about things. In fact, later on, they would go and meet royal dignitaries in Nepal and in other places. Even Guy Luthondup, his name is very controversial, was very eminent, and later on would be the resident of Kalimpong. Next slide, please. Next slide. So the other one is fostering Tibetan nationalism. Oh my God, already 200. Okay. Fostering Tibetan nationalism and reform, so he did a lot. And in that sense, he was trying to foster, industrialization has to happen in Tibet. There would be factories and all, that was the imagination, and nationalism. In fact, it is said, and Daniel Tharchin told me, that, Tharchin had actually created a stamp, a rubber stamp, which called Democratic Republic of Tibet. And his imagination was that one day Tibet will become a democratic nation. I think that is what is working towards that process. This is a copy of a petition which was submitted by the Tibetan people to the Chinese and the Tibetan nationalities, in 1952. So his newspaper started actually becoming a public forum where people were sending messages through the newspapers to the Chinese and Tibetan authorities. Next slide, please. I already have. So if you look at his newspaper, you will see actually the religious content has dropped down over the years. And in fact, quite interestingly, the scientific content, scientific news, but he was fascinated about, aeroplanes. He was fascinated about automobiles. He was fascinated about factories, and he would write about them, sketch about them. And you will see actually the religious content, and this includes both the Tibetan Buddhism and the Christian religious content actually go down. Next slide, please. Okay, so the key contribution here has been egalitarian public debate, introduction to global knowledge, national identity and reform, and expansion of communication networks. Next slide, please. I'm running out of time. So the most important thing was secularization. He wanted to secularize it. So he was not talking just about Tibet as a Buddhist nation, but Tibet as a modern secular nation. Time up, okay. Yeah, so next slide, I'll just show through the slide. So you see resisting propaganda and authority. There's like Tibetans fighting among themselves. Discourses. Next slide, please. Yes, so he was talking about pluralism and secularism. He was talking about how weaving Christianity and Buddhism. Next slide. Okay, and political framing and secularization. And the most important thing was his newspaper became a place where open letters were written by the readers to prominent people. Next slide. Over. Yeah, so this is actually a message from His Royal Highness where he says, how for 63 years and this was the only newspaper, by the way, at that time in Tibetan language in the world, which had gone and been in publication for 63 years. So it had a tremendous work. I have a lot to say, but I have completely ran out of time. So thank you, Ms. Next slide. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Barun, for enlightening presentation, and we are great to hear your perspectives of the Tibetan Bureau. So, Tibetan Bureau is a vital historical records, and this year it celebrates 100 years in 2005, and it stands a symbol of Tibetan engagement with the world. So, with next speaker, we have final speaker, Dr. Vibhanshu Verma, and he will speak on digital identity, Indo-Tibetan relations, the Tibetan diaspora in India as a site of stateless digital nationalism. So we have Dr. Vibhanshu Verma.
Hello, am I audible now? Hello, yeah. So good morning, everyone. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is Digital Identity and Indo-Tibetan Relations, the Tibetan Diaspora in India as a site of stateless digital nationalism. Well, I am from a social psychology discipline, and most of the time I invested on studying the Tibetan population and on the fields. So the theories are in here, and you can actually go and read it, but I'm much more interested in sharing my personal experience or the voices, the unheard voices of my participants through this channel. So, well, if I have to locate the seed, the origin of this idea, I can say that it is throughout the 7 years of my experience, on field experiences, interacting with Tibetan refugees, taking semi-structured interviews, and around India, and my actually scholars, other scholars also helped me. We worked as a team to make my thesis a success. And so, for example, if I have to locate where this idea actually originates from, I don't think it is from emerged during the literature review or endless books that I have read till my latest breath, but it is the observation. I see the continuous shrinkage of Tibetan political voices. The spaces has been shrinking all around the Indian sphere, especially the government institutes or the public spheres where youths are affiliated with some kind of college institutes to respect their privacy and they respect the decisions of the Indian and Tibetan contract. I don't want to name any institute or I don't want to name any authorities, but to make it much more relatable so that you can understand what I'm trying to say here, I can share some stories. While I was visiting one of the reputed institute, Tibetan Institute, for seeking permission to capture 2025 Uprising Day. And I was in this dialogue with the higher authority, and to the surprise, the authority actually denied the fact that the Uprising Day is not celebrated on this ground, under this public sphere, the public institution. And it was a surprise because just 2 years before, on 2023, I I covered Uprising Day 2023 from the same institute, interacting with the same students. And so it shows that how the things are actually shrinking, or the voices of political protests are suffocating in Indian atmosphere, because now the China and India are actually trying to come up with some solution and that actually served their national project or trillion economy dream, and it is a bad reality for Tibetans in exile. So again, so now the Uprising Day in most of the Tibetan educational institutes is now much more advertised as the uprising itself is becoming symbolically transforming to the Remembrance Day, which does not have any politically loaded symbolic what we call symbolic vices or the symbolic contract. In the same way, well, and there is the fear that Tibetan youth always have inside them, and many of you can actually relate to it. The fear of spies among them, the Chinese spies among them all the time, the neurotic spies that actually watching them. It's not real, but it's in their mind, or maybe it's real, but yeah. For example, while I was approaching two Tibetan students who were actually recently escaped from China through the Himalaya range, and when I tried to actually talk to them, they were very hesitant at the first place, because they were actually very doubtful whether I'm from the media, and if I post something online, then their family back home may get hurt, or the China will actually, it will have ill consequences on them or adverse effect on them. So the silencing is also an attempt to protect the relatives, the family members who are actually back home in Tibet. surviving under the Chinese operation. And so even if you, like, for example, if you are communicating with your family members back home online, you always, I'm not going to say that the metaphors that you use to actually communicate between the condition of Tibet under China and the condition of the Tibetans in exile, but the metaphors they use to communicate, because they know that they are being constantly under surveillance by the Chinese government. So it also points towards the Foucault's concept of biopolitics, but now it's not much more transnational biopolitics and the colonization of mind. This is the strategies of the Chinese government through diplomatic means, to not only colonizing the Tibetans who are in Tibet, but colonizing the Tibetans' life and rights who are actually in the exile space. And so they feel that they are never out of the claws of Chinese dragon. So, yeah. And so these youth, anyway, they have this spark among them. They want to express their vices. They want to express their vices that they has been discriminated over North Indian. Their experiences are actually, they are called Chinese, they are called by different names, and they want to express it. They want to still have this vice for Tibet, in complete independence, but where should they go? So but to save their, especially those who are affiliated with some kind of public institutes run by Government of India and or CTA, they want to go incognito. They want their identity to be anonymous, and that's where the role of digital nationalism comes into play. The digital ecosystem has actually provided them the safer went out space where they can be real without the consequences of being prosecuted. So that's how, when in 2000, that's how, yes, I can locate the emergence of my idea. And to the surprise, when I was actually going to the literature review, and that's the same concept of digital nationalism is not very new. And actually shared by the scholars around the world. They are working on the transition phase of from traditional mode of protest to the new mode of protest. It's like the new emergence of political protest, era of political protest. So yeah. Now if you can observe the nature of any political protest, which are substantial and going since decades, it's dynamic in nature. It's not static, it's dynamic in nature, and it changes its course ontological underpinnings according to the time and demand situation, the changing world politics, and also the changing aspects of moralities, the discourse of gender equality and everything. So in the same sense, since the exodus, the Tibetan politics has also changed its discourse from time to time. So to name some changes, there has been a change of the demands of complete independence to middle way approach, and the change in the political representation of Tibet itself, the born of democracy in exile, or the rise of gender equality debates in exile, or the recent trend of vegetarianism and linking to Tibetan national identity. Also, the human rights, something ecological awareness, environmentalism approach, which is actually changing. There's a very good thesis on the same topic, how the discourse of Tibetan diaspora has actually changing its political limitation across different decades, or how it is actually evolving. And or it can be actually moving beyond the oriental articulation of Tibetanness in the sense which was used by the B.S. Anand. So, yeah, in the similar sense, the platform or the mode of the protest you may call the political movement is changing too. And now it is not limited to some state. It has become a global phenomena. Through digital means, through digital spheres, they can actually going beyond the boundaries of nation and states. It's like a transnational phenomena, and it is somehow becoming transhistorical as well. So when and if you, it's not only related to Tibet only. If you follow the case of mass protest of 2019-20 mass protest of Hong Kong, where they actually protested against the extradition bill introduced by the Chinese government. The social media played the most crucial role in mobilizing the entire mass and executing the organization of this protest. So similarly, now when Emily Ye, she is a student in University of California, so when she asked the question, will the real Tibetans stand up? Now moving beyond the traditional window of real Tibetans, the Tibetans youth have actually found the digital platform for standing up and their own way. So that leads to the argument of my paper, and before moving forward, I should take care of the time limit as well, but there's a disclaimer, a short disclaimer, that I'm not claiming through this paper that digital nationalism has raised its height and it is actually transforming or actually entirely changed the dialogue between China, India, and Tibet. But I'm just highlighting the feature of a new beginning, which may actually reach its height in the near future or distant. So it is just, I'm just highlighting the feature of the new beginning or the new era of Tibetan political protest virtually. So as you can see that the paper, the basic objective of the paper is to how the Tibetans are actually adjusting between the geopolitical conflict between Tibet, China, and India. And also how the digital nationalism itself is actually able us to understand a broader aspect of mobilization and challenge us to see that mobilization as a social psychology or traditional social psychology is treated as a something event-driven phenomena to everyday aspect of life. And yeah, the basic argument, as you can say, in the case of exiled Tibetan communities, digital activism has enabled them to continue their struggle without compromising their diplomatic relation with India, because it is decentralized. The voices are decentralized online. So if you cannot locate the actors, you cannot actually charge them. So you can actually charge, or you can actually warn the institutes that are visible, that are present here, but controlling the policies digitally is somehow not possible as of now. So digital spaces serve as a crucial arenas for the Tibetan community, transcending the limits of cultural preservation. Cultural preservation is now itself becoming more improvised. Political mobilization, as I explained earlier, and the expression of nationhood, the desire for a nation, and while concurrently navigating diplomatic relations with host nation in the context of complex geopolitical dynamics. So, as you can say, there are two kinds of agencies when it comes to digital nationalism as well. There is one agencies which are actually recording us right now. States agencies, as you can see that state agencies like Tibetan TV, they have more than 136K subscribers on YouTube, and they are operating since 2014. which is actually trying to be a very politically correct environment for the Tibetan or the true representation of Tibet, what is supposed to be meant to a Tibetan or what is a Tibet in a much more politically correct and sophisticated way. And there is the voice of Tibet itself. As you can see the categories of YouTube channel, Voice of Tibet, they have a very huge encompassing categories, starting from His Holiness Dilemma to Young Minds and Art and Culture, Women and Tibet or Tibet in Himalayas. And now if you reflect back what I had said earlier about the transition of representation of Tibet itself, I outlined these in a much indirect manner. For example, ecological awareness, gender equality debates, or the rights of others. So it also inclines with the policies of Tibetan government in exile. And there is subaltern nationalism, and I don't want to actually name the channels because I want to prevent them from unnecessary YouTube strikes. So this time, Uprising Day, while I was covering the Uprising Day while in person, but I was also observing the Uprising Day being live telecast from live streamed on YouTube from Shillong, from Delhi, and these are YouTube channels which actually make it much more omnipresent. Subaltern digital nationalism is much more about how the voices of the refugees, which are much more unfiltered and more blunt, and its own sense captures the inner scars, inner traumas, it's a much more how it is supposed to be, and the demands that has to be met to have a fruitful life on this earth. They don't want to be alien in this world anyway. So a new form of symbolic forces has emerged, and it has actually transformed us from the traditional modes of protest, like, for example, hunger strikes, rallies, slogan, and self-immolation. Now, for theoretical lens, I used stateless nationalism as a concept of Keating's. Actually, Keating does not directly talk about stateless nationalism, but the gist of it was how national consciousness can survive even the absence of statehood. Then there is digital anthropology, Host and Miller, how digital media is an intrinsic part of everyday life and how it is a relational identity. And effective meaning-making strategy, how emotions can actually, the online space or the virtual reality can actually create an emotional space where actors can actually mourn together or can be much more sentimental in a more incognito manner. Yeah. So some of the themes that I discuss here is strategic silence and tactical narrations. Strategic silence is actually much more when it comes to statist platform, digital platform, as I mentioned earlier, and emphasize universal themes like environmental protection, Tibetan tranquility, human rights, language, but in their own language, the digital language, or in their own way, much more diffused, much more responsibly diffused, and much more the actors around the world actually can come and meet on a common ground. It's like the congruence of the ideas. The youth culture, as even in the last day, people were actually very worried about the youth of the Tibetans, and they tried to protect them from the assimilation from the host culture. But it's not the same when it comes to Tibetan digital nationalism, because they can actually experiment with their own creativity of national voices, their own creativity of demands or the protest. Okay, sorry. So, yes, it gives them the reason to be much more creative, much more participated, and without being judged whether you are being a true Tibetan or not. I think, yeah, warning has just showed up. I need to fasten up. Yeah, cultural continuity through digital means, again, it is also symbolic homeland as pointed by Brunner, and still saying, and also it actually a counter narrative to demystify the stereotypes that are used by Chinese agencies to define Tibetan as orthodox or traditional or something like that. So yeah, so discussion is simple. The soft nationalism, the rise of soft nationalism, where the most peace-oriented world can act, the most peace-oriented nation can still remain peace-oriented, but exercising their own way of creativity. But I think rather than discussing the conclusion, I think the more important thing is that to find out how it aligns with the with the policies or the future plans of Tibetan government in exile, as pointed out by our chief guest, Penpa, sir. Yes, so he pointed out some of the things, and I noted it down and just tried to understand how it relates to and what can the idea of digital nationalism. So, yeah, he said that he wants to articulate actually to show the world what is going around in the Tibetan sphere under the Chinese suppression. So digital space can do that. And focus on seeking recognition for Tibetan claim sovereignty. Yes, digital media can actually give it a much more transnational platform, transnational audience. And sending message to China and international community. So yes, here it is, digital media, much more evolved, much more powerful tool for them. And education and preservation in diaspora. So you can see that many of the digital now Tibetans, many monasteries are working on developing digital library, and also there are online classes. While I was staying with one of my Tibetan friends, he was taking classes of so from someone who was in California, and he was teaching that person the authentic Tibetan language online. So yes, in that sense, I want to wrap up my session here. And yes, one thing I want to highlight here, I want to acknowledge the efforts of the PhD scholars and the researchers. They have put a lot of effort, and their research is actually very insightful. They have done a better job than me, I think. So it's very good. I miss my PhD days.
Thank you so much, Dr. Verma. So Dr. Verma has pointed out interesting facts about the transnational repression and colonizing Tibetans in diaspora. So I'm doing a research on digital media. So I just suggest, if you want to go through the Tibetan digital media and Tibetan digital activisms, you want to study then, these kind of theories are very important, gatekeeping theories and spiral of silence theories. So why many of Tibetan youngsters and the communities are engaged with digital activism, right? Because of if you follow through the gatekeeping theories, right, there's no any kind of a verification process. So these also are kind of a pros and cons. So the kind of the problem Tibetan society arises, mushrooming of fake accounts, as well as Chinese misinformations, disinformation campaigns, and digital espionage. So these kind of areas can attribute and help you in your research, I guess. So thank you so much. So here we end with our panel. So comes with Q&A session.